What I'd like to talk about in this video are the Agile Frameworks, and understanding Agile Frameworks is a really important thing to be able to do as a recruiter recruiting into Agile roles. Because quite often when you get into the detail of what candidates' experience are, what their skills are, they might be more specific to one framework than another. And organisations might be using one framework more than another as well. So you need to make sure there's a good match between the framework experience the candidates have and the frameworks being used by the organisations you're hiring into. And the whole issue of Agile Frameworks sometimes gets quite confusing for people. You end up with lots and lots of different terms being bandied around, and you're not really sure which ones are related to frameworks, which ones are related to Agile, which ones are parts of frameworks. And the way I like to explain it is to use an analogy of religion. So say you took Christianity, for example. Christianity is a religion. Fundamentally, it has a guiding text, that's the Bible, but then within that, it has different versions of Christianity to a degree. So you have Catholicism and Methodism and Anglicanism and Protestantism and all these different versions of Christianity, all still fundamentally the same religion, but slightly different ways of living that religion day to day. And then within those different ways of living that religion, like Catholicism or Anglicanism, you then have different ceremonies that are run, different practices that are held, different masses that are run at different times and so forth, different ways of doing that sort of religion, that particular flavour of religion, as it were, day to day. And you can use that analogy and apply it to Agile. So Agile is kind of a big overall guiding thing. It has a core text, for want of a better phrase, that's the Agile Manifesto, written in 2001. And the Agile Manifesto sets out some principles and guidelines as to how to have an Agile mindset, how to kind of follow the Agile philosophy. But it's very simple. It just has 4 elements that basically say we value these things over that thing. So we prioritise individuals and interactions over processes and tools, or responding to change over following a plan. It doesn't tell you how much to value or prioritise one over the other, and it doesn't tell you particularly why to do that. It has 12 principles which give you a bit more information about the way to do Agile, to be Agile on a day-to-day basis, but you couldn't fundamentally pick up the Agile Manifesto and call it a process and say we are now using the Agile Manifesto process or the Agile Manifesto way of delivering work. What you need to do that is a framework, an Agile framework that gives you a lot more of the detail, fills in a lot more of the gaps that the Agile Manifesto leaves, and gives you slightly different ways of working within Agile, slightly different ways of doing Agile, just as you may have slightly different ways of doing Christianity if you're Catholic versus Methodist versus Anglican. So what I'd like to do next is go on and look at some of the different Agile frameworks, kind of how they're used and kind of how they differ from each other. There are actually an awful lot of different Agile frameworks. I recently completed a master's in strategy change and leadership in which I studied Agile, and as part of that I started noting down every time I read a reference to an Agile framework. And in the process of doing that, I counted 17 different Agile frameworks, and I'm pretty sure that's not all of them. It's just I've managed to find 17 so far. Some of them don't exist anymore or have been merged into other frameworks or have been superseded by other frameworks. Some frameworks are still emerging and still being developed. So it's a very fluid environment. But as I say, I counted 17 of them, and these are the ones I got. So I got Extreme Programming, XP Lite, which is, I guess, a lighter version of Extreme Programming, Dynamic Systems Development Method, which is DSDM, Scrum, Crystal, Agile Modeling, Agile Project Management, Feature-Driven Design, Lean Software Development, Adaptive Software Development, Rational Unified Process, Rapid Application Development, Rapid Iterative Production Prototyping, EVO, Large-Scale Scrum, Scaled Agile Framework, and Disciplined Agile Delivery. So yes, 17 different frameworks, and I'm sure there are more of them out there. But what I want to do now is look at some of the bigger frameworks, some of the main frameworks you may hear about, and just explain in an overview what they mean and how they differ from each other. When it comes to frameworks, as I say, there are at least 17 different frameworks out there, and they all fulfill slightly different roles. So some frameworks give you more process to follow, give you more things to do, more things where you could pick it up and say, right, we are running this framework now, we are running this process, and that will tell us what meetings to have, how often to have them, what roles to have within the team we're working with, and so forth. So one of the biggest frameworks, one of the best used frameworks, and a framework that does this really well, is a framework called Scrum, where you have 3 roles. You have the Scrum Master, the Product Owner and Team Member. You have a sprint. If you hear the phrase sprint, then that's very much related to Scrum. And that gives you a regular cycle of meetings to move through, from daily stand-ups, daily scrums, retrospectives, sprint planning, sprint reviews, backlog refinement, gives you product backlogs and so forth. So Scrum is a process that you could pick up, is a framework you could pick up and say, right, we are now running the Scrum framework or the Scrum process. And as I say, it's in all the surveys that are run, it seems to be the biggest and best used Agile framework at the moment, the predominant one. The thing to be careful of, though, is not to confuse Agile and Scrum. Scrum, as I say, is a way of being Agile. It's a way of doing Agile on a day-to-day basis, but it is not the same as Agile. It's kind of a subset of Agile, just like the other frameworks are. There's another framework called DSDM, which is really, really interesting and actually has a lot more roles within it, has a lot more meetings you can have, has a lot more process within it, and is often used by organisations who are quite keen on process and quite risk averse and quite keen to make sure it feels like there's a lot of process going on. And it can be a fantastic framework in the right environment as well. The thing you get with frameworks like Scrum and DSDM, though, is that sometimes they're silent on practices, on exact ways of doing things. And that's no bad thing, because a lot of it is about allowing the team to find its own best ways of doing things, bringing in its own practices, inspecting and adapting over time, and being agile fundamentally, and saying, well, that didn't work, so let's try doing it this way. And then if that doesn't work, then let's try doing it this way, and constantly evolving and adapting rather than fixing in stone that you must do it exactly this way. But you do get some frameworks that give you practices. XP, Extreme Programming, is one of those frameworks where a lot of the practices that you often now find in Scrum and in job ads for Scrum especially originally come from XP and have kind of filled in the gaps. In things like DSDM, you could even bring in Prince 2, which is a traditional project management methodology. So you have frameworks that give you process, you have frameworks that give you practices, you have many instances where people start to bring in bits of the practices into other frameworks, and frameworks kind of encourage and or at least allow that. And then you also have a thing that isn't a framework, but you may come across as a recruiter. It's quite popular at the moment, and it's called Kanban. And it comes from Japan, it comes from the Toyota production system, and it isn't technically a framework, it's more a way of working, a way of looking at the end-to-end process of how you're delivering work and constantly optimizing it, evolving it over time, rather than coming in and saying there is a new process and a new way of working. You're actually evolving and inspecting and adapting and saying, how do we improve what we're doing? How do we devolve power down to lower levels and let everybody lead? How do we visualize all the work? How do we minimize the amount of work we're working on at any one time to make sure we keep on delivering and keep on delivering and keep on delivering? There's some really fascinating stuff in Kanban. So yes, those are some of the different flavors of framework you get. Some give you process, some give you more practice than process, but you can bring them into the process. And one of them isn't even a framework at all as such. It's a way of visualizing work and improving and optimizing work. But they all fundamentally relate back up to this concept called Agile. Another thing you may come across nowadays is scaling Agile and scaling Agile frameworks. And this is a really nice problem for Agile to have. If you think Agile hasn't been around necessarily that long, and the Agile Manifesto was only written in 2001, when it first started out, it wasn't particularly widely used. And so you didn't have a problem of scaling. You didn't have a problem of how do we use Agile or an Agile framework across dozens of different teams, across huge companies, across thousands of people and so forth, because it kind of wasn't being used in many of those scenarios. But Agile has become more successful, more popular, being more and more adapted, it's run into this problem of scaling. How do you use it across big areas? Scrum, for example, as a framework, says the team size should be 7 plus or minus 2 people, so between 5 and 9 people. And you can't have a Scrum team of 50 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. So you need then to have multiple Scrum teams, but how do you then coordinate the work between those different Scrum teams? And this is where you get what I call scaling Agile frameworks, and they've evolved over the years, but kind of become more and more popular in the last 5 years or so. So the ones you'll probably come across are things like Scaled Agile Framework, which is kind of Scrum, takes parts of Scrum, applies extra elements of process to them, extra roles, is kind of one of the bigger and better used scaling Agile frameworks at the moment, but is slightly process heavy. There's another one called Less, which is Large Scale Scrum, and that basically is just Scrum. It just uses Scrum, but has various ways of scaling it, splits up some of the Scrum meetings, and has a lot more focus on things like complexity theory and systems thinking and slightly academic areas that look at the whole organisation and the structures of organisations and look to improve the structures of organisations, rather than just saying this is a new process you follow that scales Agile. As you scale, you kind of look at the entire organisation and you look to transform the organisation, basically. There's also one called DAD, Disciplined Agile Delivery, which brings in lots and lots of different parts of different frameworks and is goal oriented. So rather than saying this is the process you follow, it focuses much more on what are you trying to achieve, and then when you find the thing you're trying to achieve, you pick a way of, or the best way of achieving that thing from the different frameworks from which DAD is comprised. So there's 3 different scaling frameworks, and there's others around as well, but those kind of the 3 main ones you might come across. And they all, like the different frameworks for Agile, take slightly different takes on it, slightly different approaches to it. So yes, there's much more on frameworks in the full Agile for Recruiters course if you're particularly interested in it, but I would really recommend, if you're just getting into this, do some Googling online, go and read the Scrum guides, look at the Scrum Alliance website, find out more about Scrum, because that is predominantly the largest used framework at the moment. Then maybe look at XP, Extreme Programming, and some of the practices that come out of that. And then go and Google some of the scaling Agile frameworks, like Scaled Agile Framework, SAFe, or Large Scale Scrum, Less, or Disciplined Agile Delivery, DAD. Have a look at some of those and just start getting a feel for the way that the different frameworks all relate back to the same thing, to the same kind of Agile principle, the same Agile manifesto, but are all slightly different ways of articulating it, slightly different ways of living it day to day, with their own ceremonies, their own processes, and their own practices.